the key didn't turn. I stood on my own porch with dirt still on my knees from kneeling at Loretta's grave, and my key would not turn. I tried it again, slower this time, thinking my hands were just tired. The brass slid in the way it had slid in for 31 years, but the cylinder was wrong, the pins were wrong. Somebody had changed my locks while I was standing over my wife's headstone, telling her I still didn't know how to sleep in an empty bed. Then the porch light came on, though it was 2 in the afternoon, and the door opened 4 inches on a chain I had never installed. My son Derek looked out at me through the gap. Behind him, I could hear his wife's voice, low and satisfied, saying something I couldn't make out. Derek didn't say hello. He didn't ask about the cemetery. He looked at me the way a man looks at a delivery he didn't order and said, "Dad, you can't just show up here anymore." And that was the exact moment I understood that my son believed he had already won. To understand how I came to be standing locked out of the house I'd built with my own hands, you have to start at the very beginning. My name is Garrett Whitmore, 71 years old. For 44 of those years I worked as a locksmith, not the strip mall variety who duplicates luggage keys while you wait. I designed and fitted high-security systems, bank vaults, evidence rooms, gun safes, the master key hierarchies for 2 hospitals and half the commercial towers in the downtown core. When a courthouse needed something no one could crack, Whitmore Security got the call. When a jeweler was robbed, the insurance adjuster put my name at the top of the report. My entire working life was devoted to keeping the wrong people on the wrong side of a door. There is a particular irony in that, and I have had a long time now to taste every last drop of it. I married Loretta when I was 24 and she was 22, and I loved her with a wholeness that's still difficult to put into words without embarrassing myself. She spent 30 years teaching 2nd grade. One raised eyebrow could silence a classroom full of shrieking children, and it worked on me exactly the same way. Together we put up the house on Birchwood Drive board by board across 3 summers in the early 90s. I ran the wiring. She repainted every room twice because the first color never satisfied her. We raised Derek under that roof, and we laid some dreams to rest there too, the ones that revolved around a second child who never arrived. That house wasn't a financial asset. It was our whole marriage, upright and standing in wood and glass. Loretta fell ill 2 autumns ago. Pancreatic. It moved fast, and it was merciless in the particular way that disease is merciless toward people who are gentle. I cared for her at home through 11 months of it. I learned to run a feeding line. I learned to lift her without straining her hips. I learned that a man my age can survive on 4 hours of sleep for the better part of a year when the reason is sufficient. Near the end, while she could still speak, she wrapped her fingers around my hand and said, "Garrett, promise me you won't let this harden you." I promised. I meant every word. I'm still working to honor it, and this story is partly a reckoning with how narrow that margin turned out to be. She died in April. That's where Derek steps into the story in earnest. Let me tell you about my son. Derek was 43, our only child, and I won't pretend Loretta and I didn't indulge him, because we did, both of us. He had cleverness without wisdom, which is among the most hazardous things a person can carry into their middle years. By the time he turned 40, he'd burned through 3 different careers, always certain the next venture would be the one that made him wealthy, always ready to blame the last failure on circumstances or other people. 2 years before Loretta's death, he married a woman named Serena. And Serena is the reason I no longer extend first impressions the credit they used to get from me. Polished, that's the word I kept arriving at. Not a hair displaced, not a sentence unscripted, every compliment landing with surgical precision on the exact soft spot it was aimed at. She was calling me Dad within a month of our introduction, and every time she said it, something in my chest went tight. Though I told myself I was just a cantankerous old man resisting change. Loretta never warmed to her. Loretta, who could gentle a screaming 7-year-old with a touch, went quiet and watchful around Serena, the way you go still when a wasp settles on your forearm. I should have deferred to my wife on that. Trusting my wife's read on people was the single wisest thing I did for 47 years, and the one occasion I overrode it cost me almost everything. In the weeks following the funeral, Derek and Serena appeared constantly. At the time, I was grateful at least the boy is rising to this, I told myself. Serena cooked. She managed the sympathy cards. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her voice soft, asking about the house, the accounts, the various pieces of paperwork. And I answered without hesitation, because loss has a way of making a person simultaneously honest and careless. She learned the mortgage was retired. She learned Loretta carried life insurance. She learned I split our savings across 3 accounts, and that I, being a man of the old school, kept the bulk of my record-keeping on paper, in a fireproof box in the study. I gave her a complete map of my life and told myself it was kindness. I need you to hold the house in your mind before you can understand what losing it meant. To Derek and Serena, it was a figure on a deed. To me, it was the last place on earth that still bore Loretta's fingerprints. I built the door frames a 1/4 inch too narrow for standard doors, a carpenter's error in my first summer, because I was a locksmith learning the trade of building as I went. Loretta never let me forget it. Every door in the place catches in humid weather, and for 31 years every summer she'd put her shoulder into the bathroom door and call out, "Garrett, your famous doors again." And I'd holler back, "They're secure, that's the point." The joke wore itself smooth over decades until we didn't even need the words anymore. Just the look. I cut our initials into the wet concrete of the back step in 1991. I chased Derek down the driveway with one hand on his bicycle seat, and the afternoon I finally released my grip and he stayed upright for 3 whole seconds before riding directly into the garbage cans. He got up with a scraped elbow and laughed like nothing in the world could hurt him. That was my boy at 7, fearless and laughing. I've spent 2 years trying to find that boy inside the man who packed my belongings into a bag, and the fact that I did find him right at the very end is the sole reason this story doesn't hollow me out completely. I introduced Derek to locks in the garage. It was the one corner of my work he found genuinely interesting as a kid. The mechanical elegance of it, the way a handful of pins and springs could govern whether a door opened or stayed shut. I got him a cutaway training padlock, the kind apprentices use where you can see every pin through the shell, and I walked him through feeling each pin set under a pick one by one. He had a real touch for it, better than I anticipated. I remember the thought crossing my mind. God help me, I remember it clearly. This boy has good hands, maybe the business will mean something to him someday. It never did. But those garage afternoons stay with me more than almost anything, because I was the one who taught my son that every lock yields to a patient person who takes the time to understand it. It never once occurred to me that he'd eventually apply that lesson to me. By any fair accounting, Loretta and I had a good life in that house. Not a prosperous one. A locksmith and a schoolteacher aren't building fortunes, and we never aimed for that. We cleared the mortgage in 22 years by driving unremarkable cars and keeping our vacations cheap. The day I made the final payment, I came home with a bottle of champagne we couldn't really afford, and the 2 of us sat on the back step drinking it over those carved initials while Loretta wept, and I pretended very hard that I wasn't doing the same. That house paid off was the monument to a whole working life. Proof that 2 ordinary people had assembled something and held it together. And that I now understand is precisely what drew them to us. People like the Aldridges don't pursue the wealthy. The wealthy have attorneys, accountants, and a professional wariness that comes built in. They pursue people like Loretta and me, modest, trusting, debt-free, bereaved people whose entire security rests in one house and one family, so that turning the family is all it takes to collect everything in a single, clean sweep. I say this so you grasp what it was they actually locked me out of when I stood on that porch. Not a property. 31 years. The sticking doors, the carved initials, the driveway where I let go of the bike seat. The last spot on the planet that still held faint beneath a stranger's perfume the scent of my wife's lavender. Nobody spends a year gathering evidence in the cold over a piece of real estate. You do it for that. The first sign something was wrong was easy to dismiss. A Tuesday in May, 6 weeks or so after we buried Loretta. A county assessor had phoned about a tax reassessment, and I went to the fireproof box for the title. The box was in its usual spot. The title was not. Neither was the life insurance policy nor the private folder Loretta had asked me never to discard. I stood there in the study and reasoned with myself I'd misfiled them. I was 71 and in grief. Old men lose things, that was the story I settled on, and I very nearly talked myself into believing it. That same evening, Derek telephoned. There was a quality to his voice. I knew the voice of a 9-year-old who has already broken the thing and is composing the explanation. "Dad," he said, easy and careful. "Serena and I have been talking. We're worried about you rattling around in that big house alone. We think it might be worth considering your options." Options. He delivered the word the way a dentist delivers the phrase, small pinch. I thanked him for the concern, told him I was managing fine. "Just think about it," he said. "We love you." Then he hung up before I could reply, which wasn't like him, because the Derek I raised always had to have the final word. I didn't sleep. Not because I'd worked anything out, yet I hadn't worked out anything. I just felt the way a person feels in a darkened room. They know well when something has shifted out of place, the body registering the wrongness before the mind can articulate it. A locksmith learns that sensitivity over 4 decades, you develop an instinct for when a tumbler is off by the smallest fraction. My entire life was suddenly off by that fraction, and I lay there in the dark, trying to put a name to what I was feeling. The name came the following week all at once. A Thursday morning appointment with my cardiologist, routine, nothing of concern. Afterward, on an impulse I remained grateful for, I drove out to Maple Crest Cemetery to spend some time with Loretta. A fine morning, the kind she always loved. I stayed 2 hours. I told her about the missing papers the way I still told her about everything aloud, sitting on the grass. Then I drove home to Birchwood Drive, and my key wouldn't engage in my own front door. So we're back on the porch. Derek peering out at me through a 4-inch gap on a chain I'd never put there, telling me I couldn't just arrive unannounced. "This is my house," I said. My voice held steadier than I felt it had any right to. "I built this house." Derek glanced back over his shoulder. I heard Serena murmur something. He turned back to me with a face that had been arranged into something rehearsed. "Dad, it's not your house. Not legally. You transferred it to us, remember, back in the spring, so it wouldn't be tied up if you ever needed care. We have the deed. It's done." He said "done" the same way he'd said it on the phone, as if the word itself were a door being shut. "I never signed anything," I said. "You did, Dad." His voice dropped into a counterfeit register of sorrow. "You don't remember. That's actually the whole problem. The doctors are worried. We're worried. You're not tracking the way you used to." There it was. Not merely theft, a narrative. A narrative in which I was a befuddled old man who'd surrendered his house and couldn't recall doing it. Complete with witnesses, apparently. With paperwork, apparently. And a son filling my doorway wearing my dead wife's grief like a borrowed coat. Part of me wanted to roar, to put a shoulder through the door I'd built and haul my son out by his collar. But Loretta's voice was in my ear, "Don't let this harden you." And underneath the grief and the shock, something older and colder and far more serviceable was coming awake. 44 years at this work had drilled one principle into me above all others: you don't force a lock you haven't studied. You learn its pins, its springs, its tolerances, its manufacture. Only when you know it better than whoever built it do you open it, and you open it clean without a trace. So I didn't roar. I let my shoulders go slack. I let my eyes get watery and unfocused, which required no effort at all, because they were already wet. "I'm confused," I said in a voice that shook. "I think I'm confused." And I watched something ugly and pleased move across Serena's face, where she stood behind Derek in the shadow of my own hallway. "It's all right, Dad," she said, stepping forward, all warmth and venom. "We're going to handle everything. There's a wonderful place we've found, Cedar Ridge. You'll be around people your own age, no worries, nothing to manage." She smiled at me the way you smile at a dog you're loading into the car for the last time. "We packed you a bag. It's on the porch." There was indeed a bag, a single canvas duffel, the one I used to take camping. They had condensed my life into it and left it sitting outside my own front door like something set out for charity. I picked it up. My hands were trembling, and I let them tremble, let both of them watch. "Can I say goodbye to the house?" I asked. "Better not, Dad. Clean break is easier. We'll get your things to you." And Derek closed the door. I heard the deadbolt engage my deadbolt in my door, thrown by my own son to shut me out. I stood on the porch a moment longer. Then I walked down to my car, drove to the far end of Birchwood Drive, and parked in the shade of the big oak where the house couldn't see me. I sat with both hands on the wheel until the shaking stopped. And when it stopped, "This is the thing I need you to hold, because everything else depends on it," I didn't feel shattered. I felt lucid, more lucid than I'd felt in all the 11 months of Loretta's illness, because now I finally understood the shape of what had been done. My son and his wife had stolen my house on a forged deed, propped up by a story about my deteriorating mind, and they'd done it on the very afternoon I was kneeling at my wife's grave. They believed they'd locked the old man out. What they had forgotten was what the old man had spent his life doing. I drove to a motel out on the county road. The Birchwood Rest, $55 a night paid cash for a week, and sat on the edge of a mattress that smelled of bleach and old cigarettes. On the motel notepad, I drew 3 columns the way I'd once drawn up a spec sheet for a security installation. What they have, what I need. Their column was straightforward. They had physical possession of the house, a deed bearing what they claimed was my signature, and a story about mental decline. My column was going to be more interesting. I wrote it out one line at a time, and with each line I felt steadier. First, I am a master locksmith. There is no lock in that house I cannot open, including everyone I put there myself. Swapping the front cylinder was enough to stop a stranger. It was nowhere near enough to stop the man who'd engineered the whole system from scratch. Second, 9 years ago. After a string of neighborhood break-ins that made Loretta anxious, I spent a weekend installing a 4-camera security system, front door, rear door, driveway. And because Loretta fretted about her mother's antique silver 1 additional camera, nestled inside the bookshelf in the living room, dressed to look like a smoke detector. Derek knew about the exterior cameras. He was still a teenager when I mounted them, but the living room unit went in years after he'd left home, and I would have wagered my life that neither he nor Serena had any idea it existed. It fed to a small drive in the attic, and during the pandemic I'd upgraded it to push footage to a cloud account registered to an email address, mine alone, a password my son had never seen. Third, Loretta was among her many qualities careful. She didn't trust Serena and my Loretta when she didn't trust. Someone didn't simply sit with the feeling. I had no idea yet what she'd done about it, But I knew my wife and I knew that somewhere in some form she had left me a path forward. I studied that list a long while, then stretched out on the terrible motel bed. For the first time since the funeral, I slept all the way through the night. Now everyone who hears this story wants me to have phoned the police that first morning. I understand that impulse completely. But think through what I was actually facing sitting in that motel with a forged deed already recorded at the county recorder's office. If I walked into a precinct and announced that my son had stolen my house, what did the officer across the desk see? An agitated elderly man leveling accusations at his grieving son on the very day, coincidentally, that the son said I'd been transferred to memory care. There was paperwork saying I'd signed the house over voluntarily. There was, I'd later discover, a doctor who'd been coached into noting concerns about my cognition. I would have been handing them the final piece of the story they'd written for me, the confused old man, exactly as scripted. No. You don't charge a locked door when whoever's on the other side has both a weapon and a prepared story. You accumulate. You document. You construct a case dense enough with evidence that when the door finally opens, there's nothing left to contest. I'd spent my working life building locks that couldn't be picked. Now I was going to build one around my son and his wife, one tumbler at a time, while they assumed I was somewhere drooling in an armchair at Cedar Ridge. Which brings me to the other thing they got wrong. I never went to Cedar Ridge. Derek had phoned ahead, informed them of my arrival, even prepaid the first month. I learned that later, and I'll admit it struck me as darkly funny that my own son had paid to store me and managed to bungle even that. But no private facility can detain a competent adult simply because his son showed up with a bag. I called from the motel very pleasantly and explained there had been a misunderstanding and I wouldn't be coming. The woman who answered sounded more relieved than confused. And just like that, a hole opened in the story my son was broadcasting to the world, a hole he didn't know existed. He imagined me warehoused and fading. I was free, clear-eyed, and for the first time in my life I was hunting. I want to pause here and tell you about the old lion. Loretta would want me to include this part, and it also explains something that the weeks ahead drew out of me. When Derek was around 6, we took him to the county zoo. In the main enclosure there was an old male lion, enormous, scarred, the muzzle gone gray. Every other animal in the place paced or fretted. This lion did nothing of the sort. He lay in the afternoon sun with his eyes at half-mast, while the entire park streamed past him. Derek was let down. "He's boring, Dad," he said. "He just lies there." A nearby keeper laughed and said, "Son, that animal is the most dangerous thing in this entire park. He doesn't spend a single movement he doesn't have to. He only acts when the moment is exactly right. And by the time he moves, it's already finished." Loretta squeezed my hand. She leaned close and said very quietly, just to me, "That's you, Garrett." I waved it off at the time. I was a man who serviced locks and coached Little League, not a predator. But I've returned to that lion many times in the past 2 years, to the way everyone in the park read his stillness as irrelevance to the way the younger animals ran themselves ragged while the old ones simply watched, because he'd already grasped what they hadn't. Patience isn't toothlessness. It's something else entirely. My son looked at me on that porch and saw a harmless old creature with nothing left in him. It never crossed his mind to ask why I wasn't moving. The morning after I arrived at the motel, I went to work. The first tumbler was the simplest I needed to see what was happening inside my house, and I needed to watch my son and his wife behaving as if no one were watching. So I opened the laptop, pulled up the cloud account for the security system, the private one, and held my breath. The feed was live, all 4 cameras, and there in grainy color through a fake smoke detector on the living room bookshelf was my living room, my furniture, my wife's reading chair. and settled in it, shoes off, feet tucked beneath her like she'd owned the place since birth was Serena. Of course, they hadn't found the camera. Why would the thought even occur to them? They'd changed the front cylinder and considered themselves secure. They had no inkling that the old man they'd discarded was sitting in a $55 a night room, watching them move through his life, feeding every second of it to a server they couldn't locate. I watched that first morning, not to collect evidence, but to understand what I was dealing with. Serena worked through my house the way an estate assessor works a property. She picked up Loretta's belongings one by one, turning them over to check for maker's marks, sorting the pieces with real value into one pile, and the sentimental ones into another. She lifted a framed photograph of Loretta and me on our wedding day, studied it without a flicker of feeling, and placed it face down in a cardboard box. When she angled the box toward the light, I could just make out the word written on it in black marker, "Donate." I closed the laptop. Not from anger, I was in that moment perfectly still. I've learned to trust that stillness in myself, the way you trust the quiet that precedes serious weather. Loretta's wedding photograph face down in a box headed for donation 6 weeks after I'd stood at her grave. All right, I thought. All right. You want to know what's left in the old man? I'll show you. I spent the following 3 days laying a foundation, working the way I'd approach spec'ing out a vault installation, methodically, without shortcuts, with no tolerance for loose ends. Let me walk you through it, because this is the section people gloss over, and it is without question the section that decided everything. First, I required an attorney, but not a generalist. I needed someone fluent in elder fraud forged instruments and the particular art of moving without announcing yourself. I reached back to a former client years earlier. I'd rekeyed an entire law firm's offices after an ugly partnership dissolution, and through that job, I'd come to know a man named Stuart Kavanaugh. Methodical, stubborn about my age, and the kind of attorney who'd stayed past midnight every night of that rekeying job to make absolutely certain his former partner couldn't get back in. Stuart had stepped back from full practice mostly, but he still picked up the cases that made him angry. I called him and told him everything in sequence, the same way I'm telling you. He was silent a long time. Then he said in a voice like a heavy door finding its frame, "Garrett, no more contact with your son. Don't approach the house. Don't put your name to anything, agree to anything, or pick up a call from him without me present. Can you do that?" I said I could. And then, he said, "They've already lost. They simply haven't been informed yet." I don't think I've ever been so grateful to hear one old man speak with absolute certainty. Second, on Stuart's guidance, I had myself tested. This was the load-bearing piece, the one I almost underestimated. His reasoning was direct. Their entire structure rested on a single premise that my mind was gone. Demolish that, and everything above it collapses. So I arranged an evaluation with a geriatric specialist, a genuine one, and submitted to 4 hours of cognitive assessment, memory, reasoning, executive function, judgment. The results in the examining physician's own written language placed me in the superior range for my age with no detectable cognitive impairment of any kind. Stuart then sent me to a second independent doctor the following week. 2 physicians on record, 2 confirming that the supposedly confused old man was neither confused nor in any meaningful sense diminished. The foundation was solid. Now I could build. Those cognitive sessions were stranger than I expected. Dr. Hensley, thorough, kind, unhurried, had me reproduce word lists from memory, sketch a clock face count backward from 100 by 7s, interpret proverbs, work through reasoning puzzles. Somewhere in the second hour something shifted. Working through it all with a mind that felt entirely my own, I experienced something I hadn't felt since that porch. I felt sure of myself again. Because my son had done something particularly vicious when he told the world I was slipping. He hadn't merely attempted to steal the house. He'd attempted to steal my confidence in my own cognition, which is, I've come to believe, the cruelest theft available to a person. Because once an older man or woman starts to question their own thoughts, the trap closes around everything. Every key mislaid becomes proof. Every name momentarily forgotten becomes confirmation. The lie sustains itself. And there, in Dr. Hensley's quiet office, watching her pen move across the page, I had my own mind given back to me in writing. I understood for the first time how close I'd come to losing it, not to illness, but to a story told about me so insistently by my own son that I'd begun to half believe it. When she finished, Dr. Hensley removed her glasses and looked at me steadily. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "may I ask why a man with this level of cognitive function required 2 doctors to certify it?" I told her in plain terms what had been done. She was quiet. Then she said something I've held close ever since. "I see this more often than you'd imagine. Someone wants what an older person has, so they begin by convincing everyone, including the older person, that the mind is failing. It's the oldest lockpick in the repertoire." She pressed her pen into the chart, underlined something, and said, "I'm adding a note for the record that you are fully competent, and that your reason for presenting was suspected financial exploitation. If this reaches a courtroom, that notation will have weight." It reached a courtroom. It had weight. A skilled doctor, like a skilled locksmith, grasps that the most consequential work happens before trouble arrives, not in response to it. Third, and here is where the locksmith's metaphor gave way to an actual set of hands, I needed to re-enter my house. Legally, cleanly. To retrieve the drive from the attic, and more pressing to me, to find whatever Loretta had left me. Stuart resisted at first, but I walked him through the legal reality. The deed was forged, which rendered the transfer void, which meant that in the eyes of any law that hadn't yet caught up to events, I remained the most likely lawful owner of that property. Entering my own home wasn't trespassing. It was a homeowner using a key. Stuart turned that over, then said, "Once, with a witness, photograph everything. Touch nothing that isn't yours. And for the love of everything, Garrett, go in as an owner, not a burglar." I laughed, and the sound surprised me, my own laugh, unfamiliar after all those weeks. "Stuart," I told him, "I have never in my life needed to break into anything. I carry keys to doors that stopped existing years ago. I'd tracked Derek and Serena's pattern through the cameras for 3 days. Every Thursday around noon, they left together and didn't return until evening, some standing appointment I didn't yet know the nature of. I'd find out later, and what I found would sicken me. But the window was what mattered, Thursday noon to 6. So on a bright Thursday afternoon, exactly 1 week after Derek shut my own door in my face, I drove back to Birchwood Drive with Stuart Kavanaugh beside me in the passenger seat, and a small leather roll of tools on the back seat that I hadn't opened in 4 years. The front cylinder they'd fitted was builder's grade, the kind I used to tell clients was more of a polite suggestion than a security measure. I could have opened it with a paperclip, but I didn't need to touch it, because here is the thing: Derek had not considered standing on that porch feeling so certain of himself. When you are a locksmith who builds his own house, you don't put in a single point of entry. You build the door the family uses, and you build the one only you know about. There's a side door off the mudroom that Loretta and I used for 3 decades to haul in groceries. Years ago, I fitted it with a lock of my own fabrication, a restricted keyway design keys, cuttable only on a machine I own from blanks unavailable to the public. Derek had never used that door. Neither had anyone but the 2 of us. And Derek, in his confidence, had rekeyed the front, rekeyed the back, and never once given a thought to the modest mudroom door his father had fitted before Derek was old enough to shave. I inserted the key. It turned as if relieved to see me. The house smelled wrong. That landed first. 31 years of Loretta's lavender old timber and coffee, and now it carried someone else's perfume and the ghost of takeout containers. Stuart posted up just inside the door, small camera in hand, documenting everything without a word, exactly what a good witness does. I stood still for a moment and let the wrongness of it register because I wanted to keep this feeling close. A man should know clearly why he's doing a hard thing. Then I moved, and I moved efficiently, 6 hours available, planning to use 2. The attic first. The drive sat exactly where I'd secured it 9 years prior. Fireproof case bolted to a joist behind the insulation. Its small green indicator light pulsing away, logging everything the living room camera had recorded since installation day. I didn't take it. Stuart caught my arm. "Leave it running," he said quietly. "It's still capturing everything they do. We pull it at the end, with a police officer present on record. Pull it today, and they'll claim you manipulated the footage." He was right. I photographed the device, logged the timestamp, and left it blinking in the attic dark, a patient green eye watching my son's wife catalog my dead wife's silver. Then I went looking for Loretta. This had been the thing I'd held on to all week, the thing that let me sleep. My wife hadn't trusted Serena, and when Loretta didn't trust someone, she didn't just keep her eyes open. She acted. I didn't know what form that action had taken, but I knew her hiding places, all of them, because 47 years without genuine secrets between us had made sure of it. Only surprises saved for the right occasion. The loose floorboard beneath her side of the bed, nothing but a paperback novel and a pair of reading glasses I had to sit down and hold for a while. The false bottom I'd built into her jewelry box, one Christmas empty. The hat box on the upper shelf of the closet, nothing. And for the first time since I'd pulled into the motel lot, I felt something cold move through me, the possibility that I'd constructed my entire hope on a woman who at the last had simply been too sick to leave me more than her absence. Then I remembered the recipe box. Loretta kept a green tin recipe box in the kitchen. Dented, loved past all reason, crammed with index cards covered in her looping hand. Nobody but her ever reached into it. To anyone outside our house, it was the most uninteresting object in any room, a container full of instructions for meatloaf and pie. Serena, who had appraised everything else in this house for its market value, would have glanced at that box and dismissed it without a second thought. Which is exactly why I realized Loretta would have chosen it. I opened it with hands that had started to shake again. Behind the card for her mother's apple pie, folded into quarters, was a letter in Loretta's handwriting. My name on it, in her hand. I had to grip the edge of the counter. I'll share part of what she wrote because she put it better than I ever could, and because you ought to hear her voice at least once in this story. My dear Garrett, if you're reading this, then either I've finally talked you into making my apple pie, in which case good, or something has gone wrong and you've gone looking. I hope it's the pie. But I have watched the young woman our son married, and I don't trust her. 30 years of teaching taught me that when a smile never quite reaches the eyes, you count the silverware. So I've been counting. I made copies of everything, the real deed, our accounts, the insurance, all of it. And I've placed the originals somewhere safe with instructions. Go and see Stuart Kavanaugh. I already have. He holds our real will, the one that leaves everything to you, and after you, to the children of the school where I taught. Because I will not have it said that a Whitmore went quietly. Be the old lion, my love. Not the young one who roars, the old one who waits. I know it's in you. I married it. All my love forever. Loretta. She had gone to Stuart Kavanaugh. My wife, dying no longer strong enough to manage the stairs in her own home, had made her way to the same attorney I'd reached out to blindly a week earlier. She'd secured the real will in his vault. She'd never breathed a word of it to me because she hadn't wanted to put that fear in me, and she'd trusted that if the moment ever came, I'd find my own way to him. I stood in that kitchen, and I wept. I make no apology for it. Stuart came and put his hand on my shoulder and said very quietly, "Garrett, she retained me 8 months before she died. The original will is in my vault. She asked me to say nothing unless it became necessary. It has. So now I'm telling you." His own voice caught. "Your wife," he said, "was the most formidable client I have ever represented." Everything changed in that room. An hour earlier, I'd been an injured old man working with fragments. Now I held a live security feed running inside the crime scene, a valid will in an attorney's vault, directly contradicting every word of the forged deed, 2 independent physicians on record annihilating the competence narrative, and a letter in my dead wife's handwriting describing the scheme before it had even finished being carried out. Loretta had reached forward from the end of her life and left me the keys. We restored the house to exactly the condition we'd found it. I locked the mudroom door behind us with the key Derek didn't know about, and Stuart and I drove back to town in the kind of silence that for the first time in weeks felt like something other than weight. At a red light, Stuart looked straight ahead and said, "You understand, we could close this next week. File the will, file the physician's reports, invalidate the deed, you'd have your house back inside 3 weeks." I said I understood. He waited. "But you don't want next week," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd known me long enough. No, I did not want next week. And the reason wasn't simple revenge, though I won't pretend revenge wasn't in there, because it was. The reason was this: I had a live camera inside a room where my son and his wife believed they were utterly alone and utterly safe. People who feel that way say things they would never otherwise say. And watching the feed day after day, I had developed a suspicion, growing stronger by the hour, that the forged deed was not the main crime. That it might, in fact, be the smallest piece of the thing. Serena moved through my paperwork and my accounts with a fluency that unsettled me. This wasn't improvised opportunism. It was a practiced professional executing a familiar procedure. If I ended it next week, I recovered my house, Derek caught a reprimand, and Serena dissolved and reappeared somewhere else in front of some other grieving old man who didn't happen to have a camera in his bookshelf or a wife clever enough to write a letter in a tin recipe box. I didn't only want my house back. I wanted the whole apparatus exposed, the complete root system yanked up into light, where it couldn't be denied or explained away. I told Stuart to wait, and Stuart, God bless the man's tenacity, said, "All right, but we wait with our eyes open and our paperwork current." And we did. Here's what the waiting actually looked like, because people hear gathering evidence and imagine something from a film. It wasn't like that. It was a 71-year-old man in a low-rate motel eating gas station food, teaching himself investigative work. One stumbling step at a time, and missing his wife so acutely some nights that the grief and the anger became indistinguishable, and he couldn't identify which one was sitting on his chest. I built a structure to the days, because structure is what holds an old man together. Up by 6. Coffee from the lobby machine. Terrible coffee, the kind Loretta would have poured down the sink. Then the laptop, all 4 camera feeds, and the spiral notebook, where I logged everything with timestamps, the same discipline I'd used on service calls, who arrived, who left, what was said, what I could read from lips or catch as audio. 9 years of fitting security systems had shown me in granular detail how people behave when they're certain they're not being observed. I watched my son's household with the flat professional attention I'd once directed at reviewing a jeweler's surveillance footage. I was not a father watching his son. I could not afford to be. I was a technician documenting a crime scene that happened to include the last people I had left. The hardest part of every day was dusk. That was when the motel went quiet and the light thinned and turned gold, which was the exact hour Loretta and I used to occupy the back porch of the house on Birchwood Drive, not talking, just being present in the neighborhood settling around us. Some evenings I'd reach sideways without thinking for a hand that wasn't there. I'd speak to her out loud. I'd tell her what the cameras had shown me. I'd ask her whether I was doing the right thing, moving deliberately, accumulating, holding back, instead of going in and burning it all down in one afternoon. She never answered. Of course she never answered. But I always knew what she'd have said because she'd written it down for me in her own looping hand and hidden it behind a recipe card. Be the old lion, my love. The old one who waits. About 10 days into it, an ally arrived that I hadn't anticipated, and I want to make space for her because this isn't only a story about betrayal. It's also about the people who declined to participate in it. Her name is Bet Lundgren. She's lived across Birchwood Drive from us for 26 years, a widow herself, a few years my senior, sharp-minded, and about as prone to sentimentality as a length of pipe, which is precisely why I trusted her. She and Loretta used to exchange garden cuttings and frank assessments of their respective husbands. One afternoon, running out of nerve and needing to feel like a human being rather than a case file, I phoned her from the motel. I didn't lead with everything. I simply asked after the neighborhood. Bet being Bet, she cut directly through to the center. Garrett Whitmore, she said, her voice as dry as old wood. Where on this earth have you been? There's an unfamiliar man coming and going from your house at all hours. Your son's wife has been walking your late wife's furniture out the front door in broad daylight. Nobody's laid eyes on you in going on 3 weeks. I was about to ring the police. You tell me right now what's happening, and don't you dare say you're fine because I've known you entirely too long for that. So I told her, enough. Bet was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I have not stopped hearing since. Loretta told me. 2 months before she died, she sat right here at this table and told me she didn't trust that young woman and that she'd made certain arrangements, and she had me promise that if anything on the street looked wrong, I'd pay attention. So I've been paying attention, Garrett. I've got a notebook of my own. I sat down hard on the motel bed, because my wife, my careful, quiet, far-sighted wife, had constructed more than one safeguard. A letter for me. A will with a lawyer. And a watchful neighbor posted across the street, watching and writing. 3 independent lines of defense, each concealed from the others, each positioned to activate when the moment required it. She had laid out her own protection from the final months of her life, and she had trusted the people who loved her to find the separate pieces and bring them together. Bet's notebook proved more valuable than anything I could have predicted. She'd recorded dates. She'd taken down the unfamiliar man's vehicle, a dark blue sedan, and a partial plate number. She'd noted the mornings the furniture went out and logged the hauling company, an outfit called Swift Haul, which Diane Morrow later used to build a paper trail of precisely what had been removed, what it had sold for, and where the money had gone. A schoolteacher's widow with a notebook and a sense of obligation to her dead friend did as much practical damage to Clifton Aldridge as any warrant. Never underestimate a woman who kept faith with your wife. From that point on, Bet served as my ground-level eyes. I was careful about how I used her. I would not put her in any danger, and I said so plainly. Watch from your own windows. Write what you observe. Under no circumstances do you cross that street or make contact with anyone in that house. She agreed partly because she understood the way Loretta had understood that the unhurried approach was the only one that actually held. Twice a week I'd call, and she'd read me her notes in that flat, matter-of-fact voice, and I'd add them to mine, and the file deepened, and the lock I was assembling acquired another tumbler. There was one night during those weeks I have to tell you about. It nearly unmade me, and it contains the truest single thing in this whole account about what betrayal feels like from the inside. It was a Sunday. Sundays were the most difficult. They'd been our day, Loretta's and mine. Church in the morning, a slow afternoon afterward with no agenda. That particular Sunday, I opened the camera feed out of habit more than intention, and I was not prepared for what I found. Derek alone. No Serena. No Cliff. My son by himself in the dark in his dead mother's reading chair. A bottle beside him. And he was crying not as a performance because there was no one there to perform for. He had no idea about the camera. He was simply a man alone in a house he had stolen, breaking down in his mother's chair. And I sat 4 miles away in a motel room and watched my son fall apart in real time and could not go to him. Because the man he'd become was the reason I couldn't. I almost shut the laptop. I almost got in the car. Every paternal reflex I possess was firing at full volume, screaming at me to go put a hand on my boy's shoulder. I sat on my hands, literally sat on them, and made myself revisit the porch and the camping bag and the exact words, confused old man. And I made myself arrive at something I believe is the most difficult understanding a parent ever has to reach. You can hold someone in complete love and still allow them to encounter what they've earned. Shielding Derek from consequences had been the project of his entire upbringing. Loretta and I had done it together consistently out of love, and it had shaped him into a man capable of stealing from his own father. The most genuinely kind thing left to do for my son was terribly to let the snare close, to let him reach the floor he was already falling toward, and to ensure that when he got there, the way back up ran through honesty rather than around it. So I watched him cry, and I didn't move, and it was the hardest hour of my life. Harder than the porch. And until right now, I have never said that to anyone. The next morning, I returned to the work steadier, because grief that you face head-on surrenders some of its authority over you. That's something else the old lion knows that the young ones discover too late. You don't turn away from the wound. You look straight at it until it can no longer catch you off guard. I kept up the performance because the performance had become the whole game. Every few days, I'd let Derek reach me. I'd answer in a small, woolly voice and let him believe I was adrift in some rented room, lonely and barely tracking. Once he asked in that practiced, sorrowful tone how I was settling in at the new place, Cedar Ridge, the facility I had never once set foot in, and I said, "It's hard, son. Some days I'm not quite sure where I am." I heard the relief move through his breathing like a tide going out. I heard him believe me. And I despised the performance and recognized simultaneously that Loretta had been right about me all along. I did have it in me. The stillness, the patience, the capacity to lie in the sun appearing utterly spent while the young ones paced themselves ragged, because every call served 2 functions. It kept them confident, and it dug them deeper. Derek, feeling secure, grew careless. He said things on those calls that no careful criminal would. Once he told me, "Dad, I really need you to not be talking to people about the house business, all right? It confuses things. Confuses people." He was instructing me to stay quiet. He did not know I was capturing every second of it through a cheap application on the same laptop I used to watch him. I was weaving his own voice into the lock I was drawing shut around him. I got too good at the performance, though. Something happens when you sustain diminishment as a role across weeks, and I want to name it plainly because it blindsided me. You start to feel the gravity of it. There is a bleak, seductive ease to being the helpless old man the world demands nothing of someone it has written off. Some mornings at $55 a night alone, I'd find the vagueness I was performing for Derek beginning to feel like something real. I'd catch myself thinking, maybe I really am finished. Maybe the graceful move is to let them have it and step quietly into whatever remains. I believe that is the actual danger awaiting older people. Not just that the world will underestimate you, that you'll eventually begin to underestimate yourself. That you'll accept the small life, because it's pressed on you so steadily, so gently, and so often. What pulled me back every single time was the notebook and the camera, and one image I kept fixed inside the cover of that spiral notebook, where it would be the first thing I saw each morning. Not the wrongdoers. A photograph of Loretta taken on a summer afternoon years ago, sitting on the back step, with her head thrown back, laughing completely alive in every line of her face. I'd look at that photograph, and I'd remind myself that she had not used her final reserves of strength to climb a lawyer's stairs to assemble a will, a letter, a watchful neighbor, so that I could fold myself into a motel mattress and vanish. She'd built me 3 separate lifelines against exactly that outcome. The least I could offer was to be the man she'd built them for. So I'd close the notebook, drink the terrible coffee, and go back to work. And the fog would lift, because I willed it to lift. The young ones don't truly understand the old lion's stillness. It isn't concession. It's the most demanding discipline there is, appearing completely depleted, while being in reality the most alert and consequential thing in the whole enclosure. There was a cadence to those weeks that I almost, forgive me, came to find satisfying by the end. Each call from Derek was both a performance and a small accumulation. He'd phone to confirm I was still safely contained, still diminishing, still no concern. I'd feed him a little more fog and hang up and add another file to the record. He was certain every call settled him further. Every call secured another tumbler in the lock I was closing around him. Serena, I noticed on the cameras, stopped registering me as a concern altogether around week 4. In her mental accounting, I was resolved a situation, managed an old man, correctly shelved. And that was what I had been building toward. Because the most exposed moment for any predator is the moment they stop attending to what they believe they've neutralized. Serena stopped watching me in week 4. I never stopped watching her. That gap, that single asymmetry, was the entire game. She handed it to me by being precisely as arrogant as I'd calculated she'd be. Let me tell you about the morning I nearly broke the promise to Loretta. The old lion is not carved from rock. He feels things. He simply doesn't spend them carelessly. 3 weeks into the watching, I opened the feed one morning, and Serena was in the living room with a man I hadn't seen before, and I recognized immediately that this was Cliff. Younger than her jaw set, wearing the kind of studied casual clothing that announces someone doesn't want to be read. The two of them were working through Loretta's belongings, not assessing this time-taking. And Cliff reached for the one object in that room I could not quietly absorb: Loretta's wedding ring. It had rested in a small dish on the mantel since her death, because putting it away anywhere felt like something I wasn't ready for. Cliff lifted it, held it to the light, and I could read his lips clearly enough. "What's this worth?" And Serena, my son's wife, standing in my wife's room, shrugged, said something I couldn't make out, and dropped Loretta's ring into a plastic bag already holding a fistful of other gold pieces. I was on my feet before I'd thought about it. Chair knocked sideways, car keys already in my hand. I was going to drive to Birchwood Drive, go through the mudroom door, and end this with whatever it took. Promise or no promise, I made it to the parking lot. The shaking had found me again, not the trembling of age, something different. And I stopped standing on the cracked asphalt outside the Birchwood Rest, because a thought arrived with the force of a physical impact. If I go over there right now, I forfeit everything Loretta prepared for me, everything she anticipated and guarded against. One hot minute, and it all collapses. Serena walks the deed might even hold, and I become the unstable old man they've been describing all along. The ring is not worth the war. And then right behind that thought came something colder and more precise: the ring isn't gone. The ring is evidence. It is on camera in her hand, going into a bag. She just handed me a theft charge, unambiguous, documented, separate from everything else we already had. She imagines she's taking something from me. What she's actually doing is handing me another tumbler. I went back inside. I righted the chair. I sat down. I watched. I let them take the ring because I knew with the certainty you carry about the sun coming up that I was going to recover it, and considerably more along with it. The old lion watched them take their bite. He remained still. He was keeping count. That same night, Diane Morrow called Stuart with what she'd uncovered about the Mabris, and the whole picture expanded into something darker than I'd been allowing myself to consider. The Mabris were from the next county over. 2 years prior, Vernon Mabry, elderly a widower, had voluntarily signed over his home and liquidated his savings into an account managed by what his family understood to be a financial advisor. He was then moved to assisted living, where he died 14 months later. No advisor's name appeared on any document naturally, but Diane, doing the unglamorous work of reading through public records, located a notary. A notary who had authenticated the Mabry transfer and who, had it turned out, also stamped my forged deed. A woman named Charlene Speck, who operated a sign and notary shop in a strip mall, and who Diane discovered had previously lost her license once already for authenticating documents without the signer being present. Charlene Speck was the crack in the entire wall. Every scheme of this type needs a notary, and a reckless one who keeps reusing herself is a thread. Pull it steadily enough, and the whole fabric comes apart. There was one more thing. Cliff. Diane traced the man Serena called Cliff from a photograph I had pulled off the camera feed and matched him to a Clifton Aldridge, a documented history of financially exploiting vulnerable adults across 2 states and per a marriage record. Diane located not Serena's colleague or business partner, her husband. Let me say that plainly, because it took me a full minute in that motel room to absorb it. The woman married to my son, the woman I had allowed to call me Dad, the woman who had wept at Loretta's funeral in a black dress, was already legally married to Clifton Aldridge, a career predator of elderly victims, which meant her marriage to Derek was bigamous from the start, which meant my son was not the architect of this scheme. My son was one of its targets. I sat with that for a long, strange stretch of time. It changed everything, and it changed nothing. Derek had still been on that porch. He'd still packed my life into a bag and set it outside my door. He'd still looked his father in the face and said the words, "confused old man," and swung the deadbolt shut. He had caused genuine harm, and he was going to answer for it. But he had also, I now understood, been identified and cultivated by 2 professionals who had recognized in my clever, weak, acquisitive son the ideal instrument, a legitimate heir with a real grievance, who could be aimed at his own father and positioned to absorb the blame when the structure eventually cracked. They had married into my family to strip it. When they were finished, they would have discarded Derek as casually as they'd discarded the Mabris, as casually as they'd attempted to discard me. I am not claiming I forgave my son that night in the motel. I didn't. That came later and only part way. But something shifted in my chest. Some old paternal thing I'd concluded was extinct since the porch. Derek was a fool, a coward, and he had wronged me in a way I'll carry for the rest of my life. He was also, I now recognized, the last loose thread that 2 dangerous people were eventually going to need to cut. Whatever structure I built going forward, I realized, had to bring its full weight down on those who had earned it, and touch the fool who'd been used only as lightly as justice permitted. The old lion, it turns out, still recognizes his own cub, even a bad one, even one who'd forgotten who he belonged to. Before I describe what came next, I owe you the full account of what Diane Morrow found, because it's what transformed my personal injury into something larger than my own story, and it's the reason I eventually stopped framing this as revenge and started thinking of it as an obligation I carried to people I'd never meet. Diane Morrow doesn't match what comes to mind when someone says, private investigator. She's a compact, methodical woman in her 50s, former insurance fraud examiner, who does the majority of her work at a desk with public databases and a legal pad, not surveillance from a parked car. The films have it completely wrong, she told me the first time we sat across from each other in Stewart's conference room, spreading documents like a dealer laying out cards. People think hiding money makes it invisible. From someone glancing at it, maybe. From someone who reads carefully, never. She pressed a finger to the stack of papers. These two have spent 2 years reading you, Mr. Whitmore. Now someone's reading them back. What she read was a map of Serena and Clifton Aldridge's full methodology, reaching back much further than my household. The pattern was invariable, and once Diane had laid it out, I couldn't unsee it in every direction. Find an aging widow or widower with a clear title and some savings, and crucially, an adult child who is financially struggling, morally compromised, or estranged. Enter through that child. Marry them when useful. Serena had married 3 separate times on record, Diane found, without bothering to divorce between them. Use the son or daughter to provide cover and access. Forge the transfer documents with the assistance of a pliable notary. Empty the accounts. Move valuables. Transfer the elderly parent to residential care to keep them out of sight while paperwork consolidated. When complete, dissolve the relationship with the child, discard them, and relocate across state lines to do it again under a changed name. Not thieves, farmers. They embedded in families and harvested. Vernon Mabry had been their previous crop. It was through his daughter that my private matter became something I could feel genuinely proud of. Diane located Colleen Mabry in the next county, and when she first made contact, she found a woman being consumed by guilt because Colleen had been the estranged child in her family's version of this story. She and her father hadn't spoken in years when the Aldridges identified them. The Aldridges had used that gap as a crowbar, telling old Vernon that Colleen had washed her hands of him, telling Colleen that her father wanted nothing more to do with her, maintaining that manufactured distance, while they systematically stripped him. By the time Colleen learned her father had transferred his house and been placed in a facility, he was already ill and the accounts were already gone. She'd concluded that the absence of contact during those final months was somehow her fault. He died 14 months in, believing because they deliberately engineered it that his daughter had abandoned him. I drove to meet Colleen myself once Diane had made the connection, because I felt she deserved a face and not just a phone call. We sat at her kitchen table. I told her what had happened to me and she told me what had happened to her father. Somewhere in the middle of it, this self-possessed middle-aged woman lowered her head to the table and wept in the way that people weep over things that cannot be repaired. And I did the only thing I had available to offer. I told her the truth that Diane had assembled. Her father hadn't been abandoned. He'd been professionally targeted by people who manufactured that distance and monetized it. The last agonizing stretch of his life had been deliberately constructed by strangers who needed him out of the picture while the paperwork processed. It was a brutal truth, but it was cleaner than the lie she'd been carrying, and I watched it land. Something in her posture that had been braced for a very long time came down. They didn't only take his money, she said, finally wiping her face. They took the end of his life. They made sure he died thinking I'd given up on him. I know, I said. And that's exactly why we're going to make sure they don't do it quietly. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then Colleen Mabry, a woman who'd been drowning in guilt she hadn't earned, reached across her kitchen table and shook my hand as if we were formalizing a pact. In a sense, we were. Colleen had kept everything. People burdened by unearned guilt tend to hoard the evidence of what they believe they failed at. She had boxes, her father's letters, the facility documentation papers that had arrived after his death that she'd never known how to read. Inside one of those boxes was a notarized property transfer carrying a smudged, familiar stamp. Charlene Speck, the same notary who had stamped my forged deed. 2 families, 2 counties, 2 years apart. One misused stamp linking them the way a partial fingerprint links 2 crime scenes. That document was the thing that elevated my collection of camera footage from a family dispute into documented criminal conduct, because a pattern is what persuades a prosecutor to lean forward in their chair. 1 victim is a tragedy. 2 victims sharing the same notary constitute a conspiracy. Diane kept working. She found the marriage records that established the bigamy. She found Clifton Aldridge's prior convictions in 2 states recorded under 2 slightly different spellings of his name. She located the Swift Hall receipt that Bet Lundgren's notebook had pointed us toward, itemizing my wife's furniture piece by piece all the way down to the walnut dining set Loretta's mother had left her. And she found the account, a business account registered to a shell company whose address resolved to a strip mall mailbox into which $340,000 of my accumulated life had been funneled through a series of deposits, each small enough to avoid mandatory bank reporting. Structured, Diane called it. Structuring, she said, is itself a federal offense separate from everything else. These people don't commit one crime. They build a nest of them, and each one is a thread, and in my experience, if you pull enough threads simultaneously, there's nothing holding the garment together anymore. When she'd finished, Diane had assembled a binder 4 inches thick, every page sourced, dated unglamorous and devastating. She pushed it across Stuart's table one afternoon and said, "That's not a case file. That's a conviction waiting to be processed." And Stuart, a man who does not traffic in praise, turned through it, slowly looked up at her over his reading glasses and said, "In 40 years of practice, this is the most complete package anyone has ever placed in front of me." It was that binder, together with my camera footage and Loretta's will and letter, that Diane and Stuart brought to Detective Nadine Presley of the county's Financial Crimes Unit. Detective Presley, who had watched 100 cases of this type collapse, for exactly what this one had in such abundance, opened a file the same week and began quietly assembling the room I would eventually walk my son and his wife into. That is what patience purchases. Not merely your own house returned. It purchases the chance to function as the obstacle that a professional predator finally cannot move around. The chance to ensure the next family down the road never has to do what I did. Vernon Mabry couldn't be reached. But somewhere out there was the next intended victim, some grieving person with a struggling family member, and because an old locksmith had made the decision not to roar on his porch, that person would keep their house, their savings, and the truth about their own family. I never learned their name. I never will. But I built the whole slow, careful thing for them as much as for myself. And Loretta would have said, I'm absolutely certain that this was the only version of revenge worth the name. I called Stuart the next morning and told him the watching was over. It was time to set the trap. We had the will, the doctors, the letter weeks of camera footage, the notary, the Mabry connection, and Clifton Aldridge's record. What we still lacked, Stuart said, was the one thing that would make a jury stop being uncertain and start being sure. We have a scheme documented, he said. What we don't have is the 2 of them confirming it in their own words, saying what they did and knowing they're saying it. Give me that Garrett, and there's no attorney breathing who can preserve them. He paused. Can that camera give it to me? I looked at the laptop. The grainy, live image of my own living room, Loretta's reading chair, the fake smoke detector on the bookshelf, patient and recording. Stuart, I said, I think I can do better than that. I think I can get them to say it themselves. All it requires is giving them a specific reason to talk, and I know exactly what reason will work. Because watching them for weeks had revealed the one thing. Thieves only stay composed when they're certain the job is complete. Introduce uncertainty, make them believe something is unraveling, and they'll say everything, trying to assess the damage. I knew precisely how to walk into that house and make my son and his wife believe for the first time that what they'd built was coming apart. I simply had to do it as the vague, confused old man they still took me for. Stuart hated the plan. I want to be honest about that he was thorough and earnest in his opposition and argued against it for a full 20 minutes. "You're a victim and a witness," he said, frustration evident in every word, not a field operative. "You misspeak once, and you hand their defense attorney something to work with for 6 months." But I walked him through it the way I'd walk a client through a security evaluation, one component at a time. By the end, he went quiet. Then he said, "The thing experienced lawyers say when they've concluded to permit what they've advised against. If this goes forward, it goes forward my way. Nothing on your person, no wire, nothing that records. The camera evidence you already own is what matters. I won't let a body recorder muddy it. You enter as a confused old man with a confused old question. You deliver your part, and you walk out. No accusations, no confrontation. You strike the match, and you let the room decide whether it burns. Can you do that?" I could. I'd been doing exactly that by telephone for weeks. The old lion doesn't pursue the herd. He positions himself where they're already headed and lets them arrive. Here was the match. I would phone Derek in my diminished voice, and I would tell him I'd received correspondence from some attorney about papers of my wife's that I couldn't make sense of, that a man named Stuart had left a message mentioning a will, and I was confused, and could I please come by because I didn't know what any of it meant. Every syllable technically truthful, which was its elegance. Then I would sit in my own living room, directly in front of the bookshelf, directly facing the fake smoke detector, and I would let them panic. Because the single thing that could shatter their confidence was the thing they feared most and didn't know had already happened, that Loretta had left a valid will, and the forged deed had a direct legal adversary sitting in a lawyer's safe. If they believed that will existed, they'd have to discuss the forgery urgently privately in a room I had a camera in to calculate how exposed they were. I made the call on a Tuesday evening. Derek answered on the third ring, wary. I gave him the best performance of my life. Voice vague, circling, cracking on, "Your mother." And then the exact words, "Some lawyer says your mom left a will. A real one. And I don't understand, Derek. I signed the house over to you. Didn't I do that? Now there's a will and I can't make sense of it." The silence that followed was total enough that I could hear my own pulse. Then Derek said, managing a tone meant to be reassuring, "Dad, come by tomorrow. Come by around 1. We'll figure it all out. Don't call any lawyers back, okay? They take advantage of people. Just come to us." He thought he had the line and was reeling it in. I set the phone down, looked at Stuart and said, 1 o'clock tomorrow. Stuart exhaled carefully and said, "Have that camera running from the moment we hang up tonight, and don't interrupt the recording for anything." Sleep didn't come much that night, not from dread, but from something else. A kind of electric stillness. The kind I imagine comes over an old lion in the final moments, before he finally decides to rise. I lay in the dark and spoke to Loretta out loud in a 55 bursts of a night room, and I told her I'd found her letter, and I told her I intended to do this the way she'd counseled the old lion's way, and I told her I loved her. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I finally went under. At 1 o'clock the following afternoon, I knocked on my own front door. Serena opened it. The speed of the transformation on her face was remarkable from whatever she'd been the instant before. to warm, solicitous, concerned Serena. "Oh, Dad," she breathed, reaching for my arm as though I might topple. Come in, you look exhausted." I let her steer me. I shuffled. I let my gaze wander loose and settle just momentarily on the mantel where Loretta's ring dish sat empty. I let my face do something true that served a false purpose, and I watched Serena note it and file it away as useful. "Good. Keep doing that." They placed me in Loretta's reading chair directly below the bookshelf, directly facing the fake smoke detector, which was recording in color to the drive in the attic and to a cloud account they had no access to. Derek settled across from me. Serena arranged herself on the arm of the sofa, and I began in my soft, wandering voice to light the match. "There was a letter," I said, "from a Mr. Kavanaugh. He says your mother left a will. A real one, he says. It's in his safe." I looked between them, eyes wet, expression unfocused. "But I signed the house to you, didn't I, son? So how is there a will?" I'm all turned around. Could a will change what I signed? I watched the floor move beneath them. I watched Serena's face register it. Derek spoke quickly, too quickly. "Dad, there's no will." "Okay, Mom didn't have a will. This Kavanaugh is running some kind of scam. Give me his number, I'll handle it." But he had documents," I said. "He described them." I let a beat of silence breathe. Then I did the one bold thing the plan permitted. I said I needed to use the bathroom. I rose, slowly made my way down the hall with all the urgency of a man decades older, and I closed the bathroom door and ran the tap and stood there being a slow old man for a very long time, because I knew with complete certainty that the moment they believed I was out of range, those two would turn to each other and start calculating. And every word of that calculation would feed into the drive up in the attic. I didn't need to hear it in the moment. But later, when Stuart and I sat in his office and reviewed the footage, we heard all of it. And I want to give it to you precisely as it occurred, because this is the confession. This is the tumbler that sealed the lock. My son and his wife delivered it to us without being asked. The instant the bathroom door closed, the warmth drained out of Serena's voice entirely. What replaced it was flat and fast and furious. "A will? You told me there was no will. You told me all the old man's paperwork was in that box and that you'd gone through the box." Derek defensive and whining. "There wasn't a will. I went through everything. I took every piece of paper out of that fireproof box and gave it all to you and Cliff." There it was. My son's voice. On my camera. Saying that name, tying himself irrevocably to the man he believed was a stranger to everyone else in the world. Serena came back sharp. "Don't ever use that name in this house." Derek louder now, already drinking at 1 in the afternoon. "Why not? He's your husband, isn't he? You think I haven't worked it out? I know what this was. I know what those forms were for. Just tell me the old man can't unwind it. Tell me the deed holds." And Serena said the words that ended her. Measured. Cold. Each consonant placed like a nail. The deed holds because Charlene stamped it, and your father was too occupied weeping at the cemetery to notice you'd already cleared out his accounts. $340,000, Derek. It's moved. It's gone. The house is an afterthought. So no, some lawyer waving a document is not going to recover $304,000. Not unless you keep announcing that man's name until the neighbors hear you and call someone. Put the glass down and go check on your father before he drifts off and finds his phone. 340,000. Already moved. Already gone. The house is an afterthought. My son's wife. In my wife's living room. Saying it all into a camera she did not know was there. In language a jury anywhere would understand without assistance. I flushed the toilet. Ran the tap one more time. reassembled the fog across my face and shuffled back out into the hall, and my son walked me back to Loretta's chair with his hand under my elbow. I looked up at this boy I'd taught to ride the bicycle and said in my small, uncertain voice, "Everything's going to be all right, isn't it, son?" And Derek, God help him. Derek looked down at me with something I hadn't seen in him in years, something that may actually have been shame. And he said, "Yeah, Dad, it's all going to be all right." For a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. Then I remembered the camping bag sitting outside my own front door, and the pity went exactly where it belonged, into the record. I let them believe they'd settled me down. Serena returned to her warm voice and told me she'd take care of the lawyer situation, and that I should rest, and they'd visit me at the home on Sunday. They walked me to the door, the same door Derek had closed in my face 3 weeks before. I stepped out. Serena said, "Love you, Dad." I said, "Love you too." And I meant it silently, entirely, for every year that it covered. I walked to my car. I didn't turn back. I drove to Stuart Kavanaugh's office carrying $340,000 reasons the old lion no longer had any need to wait. Stuart watched the footage twice, beginning to end, without a word. When it finished the second time, he removed his glasses, pressed his knuckles against his eyes, and said in the voice of someone who's just watched a case assemble itself without assistance, "Garrett, in 4 decades I have never had a defendant hand me a confession like that. She names the notary, she names the sum, she confirms it's already been moved. She as good as identifies her actual husband." He replaced the glasses. "And your son places himself at the scene of the forgery in his own voice while simultaneously handing us the evidence that he was being exploited. This isn't a case anymore. This is a demolition." He looked up at me. "Now, quiet resolution. They return the money, they disappear. Or do you want the full light? You already know my answer. But before I tell you how the light came, and it came very bright, brighter than any of us had calculated, let me be straightforward about the interval between, because those days were not triumphant. They were the most difficult stretch of the whole business. Because I had it now. I had all of it. I held the means to bring everything down on my son. And each night in that motel, I had to make the decision again. People assume that possessing proof against someone who wronged you delivers immediate satisfaction. It doesn't. Not when one of them is your child. I'd lie there and recall Derek at 8 that summer in the garage, the way his entire face opened when the training padlock released in his hands, how he bolted to find Loretta. Mom, I did it, Dad showed me." And then I'd hear Serena's voice, too busy weeping at the cemetery, and I'd recall that my son had chosen this. With full knowledge, with his own will. Both things stayed true the entire time. That's the part no one warns you about. The decision I made in those days, I want to name it carefully, because it was simultaneously the closest I came to honoring my promise to Loretta and the closest I came to shattering it, and they were the same decision. I went to see Derek, alone, without cameras, against Stuart's direct instructions, which I had apparently developed a habit of ignoring. I asked him to meet me at a diner, the Red Wing on Route 7, where I used to take him for pancakes when he was young. I told him it was about the money and the arrangement, which was enough to get him there. When he settled across from me in that vinyl booth, I let the performance drop from my face for the first time in front of him. I watched him register it, the small flicker in his eyes as some instinct told him the man across the table was not the one he'd been managing on the phone. "Derek," I said in my own voice, level and clear. "I'm going to speak and you're going to listen. I know about the deed. I know Charlene Speck authenticated a signature I never gave. I know about the $340,000. I know about Cliff. I know his actual name is Clifton Aldridge, and I know he is Serena's husband, and I know what the two of them did to a man named Vernon Mabry before they came to us. I watched the color vacate my son's face one word at a time. "And I know," I said quieter now, "that you are not the clever one in this arrangement. You never were. They chose you because you were the ideal mechanism, a real son, a real claim, someone who could be positioned against his own father and trusted to hold the blame if anything went sideways." He tried to speak. I raised one hand and he stopped. 43 years old and still stopping for that. "I am not here to threaten you," I said. "I'm here because your mother made me promise not to let this turn me into someone I'm not. So I'm offering you what she would have wanted me to offer. It's all I have left to give you. It's the truth said plainly one time. This structure is coming down, all of it soon, and nothing you do will prevent that. What you can still choose is which side of it you're standing on when it lands. You can go on defending the woman who manufactured you as a tool and watch her take you all the way to the bottom. Or you can do the one remaining decent thing that's still open to you." I stood up and left a $20 bill on the table for the coffee. "Your mother's will is being read Thursday at 10. Stuart Kavanaugh's office. Everyone involved is going to be in that room. Be a man in it, Derek. This is the last clear exit before the road ends." And I walked out of the Red Wing and left my son alone in the booth where he used to eat his pancakes. Driving back, I had no certainty about what I'd just done. I might have just saved him. I might have just warned the enemy. He could call Serena. He could call Clifton. They could vanish before Thursday. Stuart was going to be furious, and he had every right to be. But I knew my son. I knew the fool inside the coward, and I was staking the entire thing, the whole intricate lock I'd built on, whether somewhere beneath that cowardice the little boy who ran to his mother was still reachable. Sometimes the most consequential move an old lion makes is to turn his back deliberately and let the young one resolve without interference whether he's still family. Thursday morning, 10 o'clock. A conference room in a lawyer's office. That's where I found out whether I'd judged correctly. Let me describe the room, because Stuart had arranged it with intention. And Stuart wastes nothing. The conference room at Kavanaugh and Associates runs long, paneled in dark wood, a single heavy table down its center, tall windows, the length of one wall. Stuart had configured it as a formal reading of the will of Loretta Ellen Whitmore. He'd issued formal notices, a formal reading being one of the few instruments that entitles a lawyer to assemble every interested party in the same room at the same time, without any of them being able to refuse on plausible grounds. Seated around that table at 10 on a gray Thursday morning, Stuart at the head, unhurried as a judge. Me at his right in my good gray suit, the one Loretta had selected, clean-shaved and clear-eyed, not a trace of fog visible. Derek, who had actually come halfway down the table looking like a man who had not closed his eyes in a week. Serena at his side in another expensive black dress projecting a patient-wounded dignity. She'd decided I could see it to perform the devoted daughter-in-law all the way to the end. And because Serena had pressed for it, and Stuart had graciously permitted it, a man she'd introduced at the door as their family financial advisor, Mr. Aldridge here for the estate matters. Clifton Aldridge in a suit at my table, believing he was there to manage a problem before it grew. He had come. That was the thing I almost couldn't reconcile. Diane had predicted he would, and she was right. A predator of that confidence doesn't release his instrument into a will reading that could threaten $340,000 without attending himself to supervise the outcome. He walked into a lawyer's office believing he was the most capable and dangerous person in it. He wasn't. Not even close. What none of the three of them knew was what occupied the room immediately adjacent, separated from them by a door that Stuart could open with a single motion. Detective Nadine Presley, a second detective, a court reporter, a laptop queued to footage. Diane Morrow had spent 2 weeks delivering what I'd assembled to the appropriate authorities. The appropriate authorities had opened a case. The appropriate authorities were now 15 feet away, with the door left carefully ajar. Stuart opened the same way he does everything, without hurry, without theater. "Thank you all for coming. We are assembled for the reading of the last will and testament of Loretta Ellen Whitmore." Glasses on. Document lifted. Serena, unable to contain herself, said gently, "Stuart, before we proceed, I just want to say I'm a little worried about Dad being here for this. It can be a lot to absorb. He tends to get confused, and I'd hate for him to be distressed." She reached over and patted my hand. "We just want to protect him. We love him." I looked at her. I let the whole room watch me look at her. And then I spoke in my own voice, clear enough to reach the door left ajar. "Serena, I have never been less confused than I am in this moment." Stuart didn't allow a pause. "Before we turn to Mrs. Whitmore's will, there is a preliminary matter. A deed was recorded in May of this year, purporting to transfer the Birchwood Drive residence from Garrett Whitmore to Derek and Serena Whitmore." He slid copies down the table. "This deed is a forgery. Mr. Whitmore did not sign it. We hold affidavits from 2 independent physicians confirming his full cognitive competence, a forensic document examiner's analysis of the signature in question, and records obtained lawfully from the notary's own office showing that Charlene Speck applied her stamp without the signer. Present the identical practice Miss Speck employed on a transfer of property belonging to the late Vernon Mabry." He let the name Mabry rest in the air of the room. I watched Clifton Aldridge go perfectly still, not frightened still. The stillness of a professional whose calculations have just been interrupted. He was the only one of the 3 with enough sophistication to understand in that instant that he was not seated at a will reading. He was inside a room in the process of being closed. Serena produced a light social laugh, the precise laugh Loretta had warned me about years before. "This is completely absurd," she said. "Dad signed that deed freely. Someone, probably this attorney, has persuaded him to act against his own family. Derek, are you going to allow this?" She placed her hand on Derek's arm. She turned toward him. She gave him the expression that had been directing him for 2 years. This was the moment. This was the tumbler I had left the Red Wing to set. Everything I had risked, the whole architecture, came down to what my son chose in the following 5 seconds. Derek looked at her hand on his arm. Then he looked down the table at me. I didn't nod. I didn't plead. I didn't signal. I simply looked back at my son and let him be the one to decide, because that's what it has to be. You can't give someone credit for a choice you made for them. He lifted her hand off his arm. He placed it back on the table with care, the way you return something that was never yours. And he spoke, his voice shaking and then steadying itself. "Her name is not Serena Whitmore." The room stopped. "Her name is Serena Aldridge. She's married to him." He didn't glance at Clifton. "She's been married to him throughout. I found out. I signed the documents because they told me it was a tax protection measure for Dad's savings. And then there were more documents. And then it was too far along. And I told myself it was acceptable because Dad was older, and the house would come to us eventually anyway." His voice fractured. "And then he came to the door with cemetery dirt on his knees, and I shut it in his face. I closed the door on my own father." His hands covered his face. "All of it is true," he said to Stuart, to the room, to the open gap in the door. "The deed is fabricated. The money is gone, $340,000. They moved it. I assisted them. All of it is true. And I am so sorry, Dad. I am so sorry. 1,000 times I have returned to that moment. My son at 43 coming apart at a conference table, choosing belatedly but not entirely too late to be his mother's child. I want to be truthful, I didn't feel victory. What I felt was a father's grief, which is its own ancient variety. But underneath it, quiet and holding steady, I felt Loretta. Because he had chosen. The boy who used to sprint through the house shouting, "Dad showed me," was still somewhere inside the man buried beneath 2 decades of small betrayals, and at the final possible moment, with everything on the line, he had made it back across. Serena's composure dissolved completely. What emerged beneath was flat and cold, and without any trace of warmth, and I understood I was seeing the face Loretta had recognized across a Thanksgiving table 2 years before the rest of us had any idea. She pushed to her feet. "This is manufactured," she said to Clifton. "We're leaving." And Clifton Aldridge, career predator, smoothest man in the room, rose, buttoned his jacket, and said, "We're done here. My clients aren't staying." He intended to walk out on sheer confidence, the way he'd walked out of difficult rooms for years. That was when Stuart Kavanaugh settled back in his chair, folded his hands, and said the sentence I will carry to my last day. "Before you go," he said pleasantly, "I should note that everything spoken in this room in the past 10 minutes has been heard by Detective Nadine Presley of the County Financial Crimes Unit, who is in the adjacent room. She holds, in addition to your statements just now, approximately 6 weeks of lawfully recorded video from inside Mr. Whitmore's home, in which Mrs. Aldridge describes the disposition of $340,000, identifies the notary, and references the prior matter involving Mr. Mabry." Stuart produced a mild smile with nothing warm underneath it. "You're entirely free to leave. I'd note only that the parking area is covered." And Stuart reached over and opened the door. "I want you to fix this last image in your mind, because it told me everything I needed to know about Serena Aldridge." In the half-second the door moved, before anyone else in the room had shifted, her eyes went directly to the tall windows. She was measuring distance, calculating the drop to the lot below the steps, to a car the angle of a run. Even there, even caught, even finished, the only functioning instinct in her was to find the escape route and start over somewhere fresh. No fear in her face, no recognition that anything was wrong with what she'd done. Just arithmetic. Loretta had sat across a Thanksgiving table from this woman 2 years before the rest of us understood a thing. Count the silverware, she'd written. My wife counted the silverware, and she was right about every last piece. Detective Presley, whom I came to respect enormously in the months that followed, did not raise her voice once. She didn't need to. She had the binder, the will, 6 weeks of footage, and a room full of people who had just watched the defendants confirm everything on the record. She'd been working financial crimes for 11 years. "The majority of cases like this one collapse," she told me afterward, "because all I have is one person's recollection against another's, and a jury can't determine which memory to trust, and the case dissolves. You didn't give me your recollection, Mr. Whitmore. You gave me a video, a will, a handwritten letter, a notary, a second victim, and a live confession. In 11 years, nobody has handed me a case that completed itself the way this one did. I told her the truth of it. I hadn't assembled this alone." Loretta had laid the groundwork from her sickbed. A neighbor had kept watch from across the street. A daughter from 2 counties away had preserved the evidence she hadn't known was evidence. An old attorney and a patient investigator had woven the separate strands into something coherent. I had simply refused, when every reflex screamed otherwise, to go through the door before the lock was ready. That was my contribution, not moving too soon. And Stuart reached over and the door swung open all the way. Detective Presley came through with her partner and 2 officers who'd been stationed in the lobby, unhurried, professional. The way real consequences arrive without theatrics. She read Serena Aldridge and Clifton Aldridge their rights in an even voice, while a 4th officer positioned himself at the windows, in case Clifton entertained any notions about the parking lot. He did not. Men of his type never resist when they're finally cornered. They reserve their energy for the appeals process. Serena said nothing at all. She had retreated somewhere behind her own face, already computing, already constructing whoever she'd need to become for whatever came next, except there wasn't going to be a next. Not for a very long time. They took Clifton out first, then Serena. As she passed my chair, she paused just for a moment and looked down at me and said very quietly, meant only for me, "You think you've won something, old man." I looked up at the living embodiment of everything Loretta had warned me against and said just as quietly, "No, I didn't win anything. You lost. There's a real difference between those two things. At your age, you should learn to see it. You'll have the time." And they walked her out into the gray morning. The conference room door swung shut behind her. It was at long last over, almost. There was still my son. Derek was arrested too. I need to be clear about that because it is important and because I did not oppose it, despite the fact that Stewart told me I could have. My son had committed genuine crimes. He had signed fraudulent documents. He had knowingly participated at the end in stealing his own father's home and savings. Justice that applies only to strangers isn't justice, it's selective enforcement. Loretta raised me to understand that, and we tried together to raise Derek the same way, even if it didn't hold the first time. Detective Presley arrested him as well. He didn't resist, and he held my eyes throughout, and I held his. And I gave him the only remaining thing I had to offer. I didn't look away either. But here is the piece I made sure happened, and the piece I consider the most honorable thing I did across the entire affair. Before any of it reached a prosecutor's desk, I sat with Stewart and Detective Presley, and I told them on the record everything I'd come to understand about how Serena and Clifton had located my son, worked him married into his life, put him to use, and planned to abandon him when he was no longer useful. I told them about the Red Wing Diner and the choice I had offered and the choice Derek had made turning against the people who'd used him at the precise moment when doing so cost him the most. I didn't ask that he be released. I asked that the complete truth be told about him. Which is in the end the only thing any of us can genuinely request, that the full truth be known, not only the convenient portion of it. And the full truth about my son was that he was a weak and foolish man who had committed a serious wrong against his father, and who, given one final opportunity to be the person his mother had tried to raise, had taken it. Now the outcomes. You've stayed with this a long time, and an ending is a promise, so let me honor it the way I'd close out a completed job, precisely by name by number. Clifton Aldridge, whose actual history Diane Morrow and Detective Presley unspooled all the way back through 2 states and multiple identities, was charged on 3 counts of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, along with forgery and money laundering. The Mabry matter was reopened on the foundation of the notary connection. Vernon Mabry's surviving daughter Colleen came forward, and her father's case joined the proceeding against Clifton. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 19 years in state prison. He will be older than I am today when he becomes eligible for release if he does. The old lion outweighed the young one in the end. Serena Aldridge, whose background Diane traced across 4 states under 2 prior identities, was convicted of forgery, bigamy, money laundering, and financial exploitation, and received a 14-year sentence. Charlene Speck, the notary, was permanently stripped of her license and sentenced to 3 years for her part. I'll be honest, I felt very little about her outcome one way or the other. A small, corroded person who hired out her official seal and never once troubled herself to look at the people she was helping to destroy. The $340,000 was not entirely gone, which is the thing these schemers invariably miscalculate. The skills required to move money and to conceal money are distinct, and Clifton was considerably more capable at the former. Forensic accountants working alongside Detective Presley's unit traced the funds through a chain of accounts, and over the 8 months that followed, 291,000 was recovered and returned to me. The house, the forged deed voided by Loretta's authentic will, came back to me free and clear, exactly as she and I had left it. Derek pleaded guilty. He didn't force anyone to prove anything, didn't put me on a stand, didn't shelter behind attorneys' maneuvers. He stood up in a courtroom and acknowledged what he'd done. Because he cooperated fully and testified against the Aldridges, and because his own father rose at his sentencing to give the judge the complete truth, including the part about the boy who ran through the house shouting, "Dad showed me," Derek received a sentence of 2 years, with eligibility for supervised early release. The judge, a woman about my age who seemed genuinely worn by the work, studied my son for a long time before she spoke. Then she looked at me and said something I've turned over many times since. "Mr. Whitmore, your son is fortunate in his father. See to it that he learns to earn that." And she gave him the minimum the law permitted. I understood she'd heard the old lion and resolved to let the cub find its way back. 6 months after sentencing, on a bright morning that felt something like the one where all of this had begun, I stood in my own kitchen and made Loretta's apple pie from the card in the green tin recipe box, the one her letter had been folded behind. I am not a baker. It came out listing to one side. She'd have laughed at it and then eaten 2 slices. I set one piece beside her wedding photograph, which I had reclaimed from a police evidence locker, pulled from a cardboard box marked "Donate," and reinstalled on the mantel where it had always lived. Her wedding ring came back in a small plastic bag labeled with a case number. It's on a chain around my neck now because I couldn't bring myself to put it away, and I no longer have to. Let me tell you where the people in this account found themselves in the 6 months after, because a resolution is never only about sentences and dollar amounts. It's about what people make of what remains. Bet Lundgren still lives across the street and still maintains a notebook, though these days it largely covers which neighborhood cats have been excavating her flower beds. She comes over on Sundays now. We don't generate much conversation. We sit on the back step over the carved initials and watch the light move through the late afternoon. 2 people who loved the same woman in different ways, keeping each other company in her absence. It isn't the same as sitting there with Loretta. Nothing will be that. But it's not nothing either. Bet saved my house as surely as the will and the camera did, with her sharp attention and her unwillingness to look away when something on the street went wrong. I told her so directly once. She told me to be quiet and finish my pie. That's Bet's way of acknowledging something she knows is true. Colleen Mabry and I have stayed in contact, which caught us both somewhat off guard. We're bonded by the strangest shared experience, the same predators, the same playbook. It turned out there was a genuine friendship available underneath that. She testified at the trial steadily and with clarity. Afterwards, she told me that standing in a courtroom and stating for the record that her father had been deliberately targeted, not deserted, not abandoned, but targeted, had restored something she'd believed was permanently gone. She started a support group in her county for adult children of defrauded parents, people carrying the particular guilt of not having been present when presence might have helped. She asked me to speak to the group. I did, and I'll do it again. Her father, Vernon, never saw justice in his lifetime, but the thread from his notarized transfer that smudged familiar stamp put 19 years on the man who engineered the end of his days. Colleen says her father would have taken satisfaction in being the thread that finally held. I think she's right, and then there's Derek. I've left him for last because his story resists the clean resolution I can offer for everyone else, and I won't pretend otherwise. He served his time, most of it, and entered the supervised program, and has by all evidence applied himself to it honestly. He attends the meetings. He found honest employment driving a delivery route up before daylight, the same path run the same way every day. There's something that is almost funny and almost sacred about a man who chased shortcuts his entire life, finding a kind of peace in the absolute regularity of honest work. We are not what we were. I don't know that a father and son recover fully from a door closed on a porch. But we are something. He comes to the house on the first Sunday of each month. The first time he came back, he stood in the driveway for a long while before he could bring himself to walk to the door. When I opened it, before he said anything else, he said, "I'm not asking to be forgiven, Dad. I'm just here." And I understood that was the most truthful statement he'd made to me in 2 decades. I stepped back and opened the door, and my son walked into the house he'd once shut me out of, and we ate dinner together, and it was quiet and uncomfortable and genuine. That is where we are not mended trying. In my experience, sustained trying is most of what healing amounts to. The last time he visited, he stopped at the workbench in the garage on his way out. I came in and found him standing there holding the old cutaway training padlock, the one I'd used to teach him when he was 7. He hadn't heard me enter. He was turning it slowly in his hands, feeling the pins the way I'd shown him a lifetime ago. He looked up and realized I was there and set it down with something embarrassed in his expression. "Keep it," I said, "if you want it." He looked at it for a moment. Then he shook his head and returned it carefully to the bench. "No," he said. "It belongs with the person who actually knows what to do with it." He left. I stood in the garage with that padlock in my hands, and I understood that my son had finally grasped the lesson I'd been trying to give him since he was a child. Knowing how to open something is not the same as being entitled to. That is the entire distance between a locksmith and a thief. It took him 43 years and a prison sentence to arrive there. But he arrived. And Loretta, I have to believe this knows that he did. There is one more thing I did with the recovered money. It's the only part of this whole story I'd want etched somewhere permanent. Loretta's will directed everything after me to the children of Garfield Elementary, the school where she spent 30 years teaching 2nd grade. I couldn't wait for after me. So I took $120,000 of the recovered funds and established the Loretta Whitmore Reading Fund, which purchases books and underwrites a reading specialist at the school where my wife gave most of her working life to small children who were trying to sound out words that outpaced them. There is a small plaque beside the library door. Her name is on it. Below her name is one line which I selected, and which is the same line I'll end with here. I attended the dedication in the spring. A 2nd grade class sang badly beautifully, the way children at that age sing everything. A girl in the front row read aloud from a book, working carefully through a word that was too large for her, missing it once and finding it the second time. I had to step outside. Because that was Loretta's whole life right there in that child's face, small people working through things that are too large for them, getting it on the second try. She devoted 30 years to that belief, and then she spent whatever strength she had left imparting the same lesson to a grieving old locksmith who had convinced himself that everything was gone. Second try. Don't quit. Sound it out. People who hear this story ask eventually what the lesson in it is. I've turned it over many times, and I think it's this. My son changed the locks on the house I built while I stood at my wife's grave, and he believed that was the end of me. He assumed that a locked door was a form of power. But a lock is only ever as reliable as the trust it's built on, and the moment you use one against the person who showed you what doors are for you, haven't excluded anyone. You've enclosed yourself alone with the kind of person who does that. They changed the locks on an old locksmith. They did not once stop to ask themselves why the old man didn't seem worried. That was the last thing Loretta taught me, written on a folded piece of paper tucked behind a recipe card. And it's what I'll leave you with. Your stillness is not your weakness. Don't roar. Don't give chase. Accumulate your evidence. Keep the promises you made to the people who loved you. And when the moment arrives, and it will open the door so precisely and completely that there is nothing left for anyone to contest. They changed the locks. They simply never once thought to ask why the man who built the house wasn't worried. What you just heard is only the surface. The real question isn't whether Garrett can prove what happened. It's whether the people he trusted most planned this long before he ever knew to be afraid. Here's what I want to ask you. If someone in your family betrayed you like this, would you fight back? Or would you walk away? Welcome to Alpha Dad Stories. I'm glad you're here. If these stories mean something to you, hit follow so you never miss one. And while you're at it, drop a comment and tell me what you're doing right now while you're listening. Before we begin, names, locations, and some details in today's story have been changed to protect those involved. Any resemblance to specific real individuals is coincidental. Garrett Whitmore was 71 years old, standing on the porch of the home he built with his own hands, and he wasn't allowed inside. That image has stayed with me since I first came across this story. Not because it's dramatic, though it is, but because of what it quietly says about how fast a life's work can be taken when someone decides your age makes you an easy target. What held Garrett together wasn't rage, it was Loretta. A letter in a recipe box, a neighbor named Bet who kept her porch light on, an attorney named Stewart who had been trusted with the real will long before anyone suspected it would ever be needed. Loretta had seen something Garrett hadn't, and she quietly built him a lifeline anyway. That kind of love doesn't announce itself. It just shows up exactly when it's supposed to. I think about that a lot when I hear father stories like this one. The lesson isn't only about elder fraud or forged deeds. It's about what we put in place for the people we love before the worst happens. Loretta practiced that. Garrett honored it. Here's what this story left me with: 4 things worth carrying. Prepare while you're strong, because the people who love you may need what you build before you're gone to explain it. Family justice rarely comes loudly. It comes through patience, documentation, and one person who refuses to let it go quietly. Trust is not the same as blind faith. Garrett trusted wisely, and that difference saved everything. And the truth, even when buried under forged paperwork and legal maneuvering, has a way of finding the light. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Alpha Dad Stories so you're here for the next one. And leave me a comment. I read every single one. Thank you for spending this time with me. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next story.